So we
All
kind of got the
right,
nudge to
folks.
go back in a proposal.
My time says we're good to go. Can everyone on Zoom hear me okay? Give a thumbs up. We're just giving you a little thumbs up emoji. I know you're good. Awesome. Perfect. Thank you guys. So thank you all, both we're here in person and online for coming today. In case you weren't aware, this is Partners of Scott County Watershed new forum called the Conservation Quarterly. I'm Kelsey Massengale. I'm our coordinator, and today we're going to have Mick talking to us about rain garden fundamentals. Before we get rolling on that, I'm just going to run through a few quick slides in case you're not as familiar with Partners, or just to let you know what we have coming up, because spring is here and so is the busy season. So lots of things coming up here. Right. So really quick, for those of us who are on Zoom, if you have any questions during the presentation, if you could just enter those into the Q&A box that should be down there. Q&A isn't available, put it in the chat. We'll answer those at the end. And we do have Josh here who's going to be helping us with some technical guidance. So that's why my name says Josh right now. But if you have any questions, just throw them in there and we'll do our best to take care of them as we go. This presentation will be recorded. Actually, I gotta hit that record button right now. It's actually a reminder to myself. Nope, it is recording. We're good. We're good. All right. So this will be recorded. It'll be up on our YouTube page after. So if you want to go back and reference anything or share it with a friend or colleague who couldn't be here today, that is an option. As I mentioned, we've got lots of things coming up. So some things on the forefront here. We'll be at the Bettendorf STEM Expo this weekend. So if you have any littles that you know, or maybe you just want to go play around in some STEM yourself, we'll be at the Bettendorf Middle School, and that's from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. Then we have a trash cleanup, coming up next month out in Princeton. So taking lots of folks as volunteers for that work to be done. And then we have our spring snapshot coming up in just about a month here. So again, lots of volunteers needed. If you want to come get your hands dirty, go play in the water for a little bit and help us out, that'd be great. So all this is also on the Partners website, and registration links can be found on there too. Bettendorf STEM Expo is not a registration required event. And of course, we can be doing all of this, the education and the cleanups and conservation quarterly and all the other things I've listed without the partners. So those who are here or online that represent these organizations, we appreciate you. And if you want to be part of that, there's lots of ways, per usual, throw it on out. So consider getting involved in any way that you can. And there's more information on our website or on the back wall if you're here in person about this. And there's the cool water bottles that you get for being a member displayed so nicely on the back table. All right, and with that, I'll hand it over to the main event, and Mick here who will come up and tell us all the things we need to know about rain gardens.
Thanks. Thank you, Kelsey. Thank you all for being here. Let's see here. I'm going to switch over to the program. Okay. Let's click here.
Tricky. This is actually a Ford advertisement on your buying vehicle today.
Well, I can only say, oh, sorry, guys.
I was just saying, I think the microphone isn't super loud, but it's more helpful for those who are on Zoom here. You can speak up some more. Right?
I can do that.
Didn't want to scream and.
Apologize for the delay here.
Would you like me to introduce myself? But all right, now. So I am Mick Olderson. I wear many hats. My business is Build Mark Inc. My wife and I put this business together in 2012. So I guess this would be the 12th full year that we're into this. And I wear many hats. My background training, I grew up learning earth moving, family trade, and I went to school and ended up in the conservation biology and spent some time working here locally until I decided I really wanted to get back to hands-on and doing work in our community. I'm a Coal Valley native, Coal Valley, Illinois, and I've been in to this date. I'm still just outside of there near Orion, Illinois. But today I'm talking about rain gardens. So this is one thing that I've dabbled in over the years, and I just enjoy. So one of those aspects of landscaping that kind of pulls in both my earth moving background as well as the conservation biology with native plants and things like that, water quality improvement.
It does not want to put us the projector. What we may have to do, we make this need to
Open the screen here.
kind of go from the screen today.
We can make this happen.
I apologize. Wow.
With this one. All right, no problem here. Down arrow.
If you click up in the presentation, then it should allow you to use the down arrow.
I click over here.
Yep.
There we go. All right. I'll tell you what, we'll just move right into this thing. So we're talking about rain gardens, but I just wanted to start off with something basic here. And just draw the distinction between what I call conventional gardens and concave gardens. Concave referring to basically the depression or valleys or these low points that can be gardened. Seems that most people like to use a berm or some sort of elevated space to present their gardens or their landscaping around their homes. A lot of the time it's because it actually facilitates good drainage and you have more control over controlling the moisture in the soil. But gardening in a depression is kind of a whole other thing, and it can be very effective ultimately to help with stormwater quality, and of course wetlands and ponds, bioswales fit into this category. But today we'll focus on rain gardens, and I suppose for a working definition, a rain garden really is we're looking at a landscaping feature that collects stormwater runoff and then ultimately facilitates the absorption of that water into the soil. There are other components of that going on, but that'd be the main thing here. And my goal today is to present how you would go about creating a rain garden. Some of the key parameters, I've broken it down into 7 different categories. There's a few slides in here that are very text heavy. I would say they're very crummy slides, but my objective is to sort of give a sense of the overall scope of the challenge, but also then there'll be a slide following some of these that whittles it down to sort of a basic principles or sort of the pragmatic step you might be able to do to take many variables and then put it into practice with a more pragmatic solution. Let's see here. So this illustration depicts, what we're talking about: runoff from surrounding land coming into a depression, and ultimately most of that water filtering down into the soil. We'll begin here with rain garden place. So, one of the practical things is, work with the topography you have. Every yard is different. And so most of them, probably a conventional landscape now is a fairly flat surface with certain points where your water drains to. But certainly you have a roof with the downspouts, which are important to keep track of. And basically your goal is to try to determine a location, I suppose, where you'd like to put a rain garden, assuming that's your objective. Certainly low points can be very handy, because if you find one, sometimes all you have to do is remove a little bit of soil from the ground, assuming other assumptions are met, and you basically collect that water there, and your rain garden has the potential to flourish on gentle hillsides, valleys. I call it flipping the wedge method, where you can excavate a portion of the ground. I guess maybe I should specify here this small little diagram up here on the right. The green dashed line perhaps is the existing topography. So when you flip the wedge, you excavate a little bit to the uphill side, flip it to the downhill side to create a small berm, and create a pocket then with which to capture water. The steeper the slope, this becomes more complicated. You may have to move into retaining walls, things like that. But for today, we're just assuming it's a nice gentle slope that you could put something into a hillside like that. You could capture the point sources of water. I mentioned downspouts, drains, swales. These are helpful. You know where those are at. You can locate a rain garden at the outflow of those or downstream from them. But certainly consider proximity to your home, your other structures. The last thing you want to do is attempt to solve a problem by capturing runoff in order to just put it into the ground and have it recycle back into the drains around your home's foundation or basement. That could certainly be a problem. You start feeding into your sump pump, and you can create a larger problem perhaps than what you started with. General rule of thumb is keeping it at least 10 feet away from your foundations, perhaps further depending on how your yards slope. Void utilities. If you're not aware of where your utilities are in your yard, I mean, certainly before you dig, you should call the 811 line, have somebody come out and mark your utilities so you know where they're at. Some, like cable, television, they can be buried just within a few inches of the surface of the ground. And generally, you don't want to put a rain garden right over your main electric line or gas line. So, and then assess, I have here at the bottom, sunlight. It's just one of those things you might want to keep in the back of your mind as you begin. Sunlight's your friend with rain gardens. The more light you have, the more options you have with plants, but there are certainly ways to create a successful rain garden with less light and part shade as well. I do have a note here at the bottom about avoiding trees. I say this usually just because depending on how you orient a rain garden, perhaps on near the drip line of a tree on the south side. So again, south side of the tree, you still get most of your sunlight. There you shouldn't have problems. And some trees, even damaging a little bit of the root structure isn't so bad. I found that some water-loving trees, silver maples and maybe river birch, things like that, they seem to do just fine. Cut into a little bit of the roots, but you provide that rain garden and they'll survive just fine alongside a rain garden. Right. So I'm going to start just a process of thinking a little bit mathematically of how you might go about planning your rain garden. So let's assume you found a location that you think fits some of the criteria discussed in the previous slide. I reduce this to an equation of volume of runoff basically equals your rainfall multiplied by the drainage area and then the percent of runoff. And here's some summary definitions for this. Certainly rainfall is just the depth of water that comes out of the sky on a rain gauge. Generally that's recorded as inches, and around here in the Quad Cities, 1.25 inches is an important number because it represents about a 90% 24-hour rainfall. So during the course of a year, 90% of the rain events we have within 24 hours should not exceed 1.25 inches. And this just gives us sort of an engineering metric to decide, well, how much water are we trying to capture in our rain? Of course, the drainage area, it's all the area that drains to the rain garden. It could be made up of impervious surfaces, roofs and concrete driveways, and generally pervious surfaces or porous surfaces like lawns and other type of landscaping areas, green areas. And then the percent runoff is important because when you think about it, no matter how much water comes from the sky during a rain event lands on different surfaces, not all of it becomes runoff. So the portion that actually starts moving across the surface. And there are coefficients for this, which are generally just a decimal fraction of the amount of water that begins to move as runoff. For instance, concrete, depending on what it is, 80 to 95%, perhaps 100% once you get to a heavy rain. And then lawns are somewhere 35% or less in general. Many other factors involved in this, though, slope, soil quality, etc. But that gives a sense of it. So, it might be a little bit overwhelming to think, well, how do we deal with all those different numbers? And what I think to do then is to reduce this down to a practical way of handling it. And an extremely conservative way might be to simply take, if you have a known area, certain pieces of roof or driveway or yard, and you can start to calculate and see those shapes and where they flow to when the runoff occurs. If you just assume 100% is runoff, this will give you a very conservative estimate of the amount of water you would be dealing with for the rain garden. And so, of course, you could reduce an equation for your runoff to the amount of rainfall multiplied by the drainage area. But I think a better one is to at least divide these surfaces up into the impervious and pervious or porous surfaces. And in this case, the better estimate, you just assume the concrete and the roof is 100% runoff. Go with 50% for the porous surfaces. And then plug this into the same equation, a different route here. So we have then the rainfall amount multiplied by the sum of the impervious area plus half of the porous area. Make sure you do your order of functions to get to the answer. Some basic math. So to start to put this together a little bit, here's an example. Imagine you've taken the time, graph paper can be your biggest friend here too, to say map out a portion of your yard or perhaps the whole yard. And you start, you go out upon your yard and you're starting to calculate, where's my water flowing to? And sometimes, just a big long bubble level can be helpful with this. You have access to a laser level. I mean, it sounds a bit complicated, but if you have the right tools, you can start to get a sense of the approximate areas that drain to particular points. Rain events are your friend in this. You can go out and just watch and see what the rain does. Sometimes you can visually see it. But in this case, let's assume we have a home here, nice little hip roof design. And it just so happens that this particular triangle of 225 square feet drains to a particular downspout. And then we have a portion of yard, let's assume it's about 675 square feet. And in the end, all the water ends up down here where that blue circle is. So this would be the proposed location for a rain yard. And in this case, to do our calculation, we have a rainfall number. This 1.25 inches I mentioned earlier. This is our 90% threshold. I throw a divided by 12 in here just to convert the units from inches to feet. And then after that, we plug in here the impervious roof area 225 and the 675 square feet of lawn divided by 2. Start to pull this all together, and what you would find is if we have a rain event like this, about 59 cubic feet of water would find its way to that blue circle there down in the bottom. So this is an important number, and we'll come back to it. So here's the next component. I would say between the total runoff and the drainage rate of the soil, these are the two components. If you want to get mathematical in this, that we really need to help calculate a proper rain garden size. So simply speaking, the different soils have different rates at which water absorbs. You can call this the percolation rate. Infiltration is another word often used. And in general, if you have a sandy soil, imagine a rain beating down on a beach, that water just soaks in quite quickly. So generally, sandy soils pass water very swiftly. And then the more clay and small soil content or small particle content in the soil, it becomes fairly impervious. If you're building a pond, that's kind of nice. You want nice clay soils under your pond to create a liner so your water's not constantly moving in. But with rain gardens, we're trying to facilitate that drainage. And so perhaps a rule of thumb we'll use today is that let's assume we'd like our rain garden to drain within 12 to 24 hours. I say let's assume that just because there are situations where 24 to even 48 hours could be permissible depending on what your objective is. But this would give us a rain garden that functions very well and drains very well. And so we're going to use a drainage rate from the soil ultimately to determine the ponding depth that we'd like for the rain garden. So one way to do this is to actually attempt a test yourself. This is basically we call it the percolation test. In this, what we're trying to do is establish a column of water. And basically what you can summarize from that is the rate at which that column of water moves into the soil. Will give you a sense of the rate of infiltration. So a certain number of inches of water can pass into the soil at a given amount of time. So if you were to dig a hole like this, fairly cylindrical in shape, and let's just say it's 12 to 24 inches. This is important, as you'll see here maybe in a minute. And then let's fill this hole with at least 12 to 24 inches of water. Ideally, you let that sit for just a few moments, come back, and you measure what we call the initial depth of water in your hole, and then come back potentially 12 hours later, and then another 24 hours later. And what you're trying to do is establish the difference between the start in 12 hours and then the 12 hours and 24 hours, and measure that change in depth. We could use those then to calculate an average of the amount of water that is absorbed after each 24-hour period, or excuse me, 12-hour period. Or you could then divide that by 12 to get to an hourly rate. Again, if you're not much for math, I have a way to simplify this on the next slide here. I guess to point out here for step number 5, this is a process if you're trying to be real mathematical and accurate on it. Repeat this test several times, maybe in different locations within a rain garden area, or even using the same particular hole if you're trying to be very accurate. But if that's not your objective and you're looking for a little more practical way to approach this, we can ignore the measurements. And one way to do that is to still dig a hole, like we mentioned, at least 12 inches deep up to 24. And let's just fill the water with hole, as we said before. And there's really only 2 things then at this point you really need to pay attention to. If the hole is empty after 12 hours, then you have a percolation rate over 1 inch per hour. And basically, if you have that occur, then you're in very good shape, because at that point, you can more or less just move on with your rain garden design at multiple depths, and you'd be good to go. If there's still water in the hole after 12 hours, but it's all been moved into the soil after the next 12 hours, so after a 24-hour period, then your percolation rate is at least half an inch per hour up to the 1 inch, somewhere in between. And that's what we'll work with for the rest of this talk, is assuming you have either a 1 inch or half an inch percolation rate per hour. But what do you do if you have something that's less than that? This is where you can attempt to do calculations on your own and go with it, but it may be more beneficial to have a little more engineering in your rain garden. Some of the times these are referred to as enhanced rain gardens, and you begin to work with different types of amended soils, subdrains. You can start to engineer things into these rain gardens to facilitate that better drainage. If you're a little bit adventurous, you could also rework your site to function more like a wetland or a pond. These are the kinds of things I love to experiment with on my own. But the last thing you want to do is end up with a stagnant pool that you're dealing with mosquitoes and things like that. So you want to be a little bit cautious. All right. Yeah, I apologize if this is coming out like a fire hose of information, but I'll try to continue to reduce this a little bit complexity. So this, from the previous slide, I suggested, what if we work with one of 2 different percolation rates, either the 1 inch per hour or the half inch per hour. And if the goal is to have a rain garden that drains within 12 hours, we can do very quick math to determine an average ponding depth that we could target for a rain garden. If you have a 1 inch per hour, at least 1 inch per hour rate, multiply that by 12 hours, you end up with 12 inches. So you could easily dig a rain garden with a ponding depth of 12 inches that'll still be dry after about 12 hours following a rain event, and you're good to go with that. If your percolation rate is between the half inch to 12 or half inch to 1 inch per hour, so at least 1/2 inch per hour, you multiply by 12 hours, gives us a value of 6 inches or half a foot, and you could build a rain garden that is at least 6 inches of ponding depth, and that too will be dry within 12 hours. So if that's your objective, these are 2 real simple rules of thumb with which you can proceed. Around here, most soils, especially if it's undisturbed, will have no problem achieving this. But if you're in some newer developments where the topsoil or the loamy top's been taken away and you're down to the clay soils, that's where you'll find some of these numbers become more important, because you're walking a little finer line. I'd almost be willing to say if you build any rain garden at 6 inches deep, you'd be good to go around here. But like I said, there's caveats to that, depending on your soil quality and water table and other things like that. All right, so let's attempt another math problem here. This is our example from the rain. So we mentioned the volume of runoff we calculated earlier was this 59 cubic feet. What we're trying to determine now is just what size of rain garden should we be targeting, and that's a function of the depth of rain garden that we have. Since we're dealing with volumes, we're not dealing with simply square footage of volumes, but it sure is practical to convert that volume we're after down to a square footage. So when you're trying to lay out a rain garden, you can simply go out and try to draw a particular perimeter or shape that achieves square footage. And so with this equation, if you have a volume of runoff, and then you simply divide it by the average ponding depth you're after, make sure the units are the same, you can obtain that number. And so in this case, if we had 59 cubic feet of water from the runoff scenario we show here, you divide that by, say, half a foot. So let's assume we're going for a 6 inches deep rain garden. That's 112 square feet. So all that math and all that investigation reduces down to saying that you can build a rain garden that's 100 12 square feet, and this thing should be overbuilt. You should have no problem having a rain garden that functions well, drains within 12 hours. And so you've now set the table, with a great canvas to do the rest of your rain garden work on. At least that's the objective. Just a few basic tips, I guess. So if you get to this point, you know what size of rain garden you're after. Sky's the limit on your creativity, so to speak. If you're trying to be very technical about your sizing, starting with basic geometric shapes is helpful. Again, it's kind of back to some basic math and different equations, but calculating the area of a rain garden or a rectangle or circles, triangles, you can start with that and then adjust your perimeter to achieve whatever you're after, whatever look. I like to work with more organic or irregular shapes. If it's a very complex shape, another option is to draw your irregular shape first. Let's say you have a shape you're really after, and then just start building into that shape as you're calculating its approximate area. Start drawing in different geometric shapes, calculate areas, and just slowly cobble together an estimate of it all. So again, we're going for there's some buffer built into our equation already, and we're just trying to get close to whatever it is the aesthetic appeal of what you're after. Graph paper can be your best friend in this too. If you draw it on graph paper and you assume, say each square is 1 square foot, then you add up your squares after it's drawn, and you'll have a shape you're after. You just have to transfer that to your yard. Establishing ponding depth. So in the previous example, we suggested let's go for 6 inches of ponding depth. The thing to keep in mind with water, of course, is that sometimes it's counterintuitive to people, but it seeks its own level. So no matter how big of a perimeter or berm or dam or whatever you have around a pond, the low point's where your water is going to drain. And so in the end, whatever the low point is in your perimeter of your pond, that will set your ponding depth, and that'll be your reference point to command how much excavation you need to do. Some of the easiest ways to do this, simply picking your point that you'd like to use as reference and pulling a level string line across different portions of your rain garden. At that point, you could just hand dig and do your work and just measure down to your digging depth and confirm you're in the ballpark of your 6 inch depth. Sometimes just a board with a bubble level on it. You can be creative. There's different tools that way that are fairly simple, especially for smaller rain gardens. Laser levels, if you've ever used one of those, can be really handy on larger rain gardens to set your depths. So just a tip there. I had 2 diagrams here, but since we're having a little trouble, it's like they're overlapped with this, but that's all right. My next point then would be, so you have a rain garden, you know what you'd like to build, you picked its size and you put it into place. One thing to assume with all rain gardens is that they will overflow eventually. Even if you're tackling 90% of rains, that means 10% of the rains may overflow your rain garden, depending on the buffering capacity. And of course, we have our 25-year rains, 50-year rains, etc. And so, handling that water is important just to avoid a mess or any kind of damage. If you have a rain garden that's more or less just depression out into a lawn area, typically if it overflows, all it's going to do is elevate up into the lawn grass and then come back down. There's really no consequence, and you don't really have to think about it. Perhaps if there's mulch or something in there, it'll leave a little mess around the edges, but you can clean it up easy enough. But what you have to watch out for is when you have rain gardens that have any kind of slope that yield some sort of berm on some side of your rain garden. So in this case, typically the berm will be the place that your water has to exit over if it overflows. And so the easiest thing to do is to pick a designated location that's just slightly lower than the rest of the elevation perimeter of your rain garden, and make that the point where the water exits. One thing you can do is make it decorative and armor it a little bit with stones. The photograph on the right depicts this. This is basically a 2-tiered rain garden in its early construction phase, where there's a pool to the top, and then if that overflows, it flows down in the next pool below before it comes out, exits towards the bottom of the screen. Again, we're not looking at big rushes of water, but we're just trying to control that flow of water as it migrates through the rain garden. If you have an issue though, where you need a little more robust infrastructure, again, now we have 2 overlap diagrams here on the bottom. But I guess fortunately the one with the black pipe, that's what the black segment in the line represents, You may need to add some sort of piping structures, sand pipe of some kind, different ways in order to facilitate the movement of that water out of the rain garden without it going over your berm. That is another possibility, and you can pipe it to a lower elevation wherever you think it is suitable to have it exit. One word of caution with this would just be, you want to set your pipe in such a way that, assuming when the water starts going to your pipe, it will be just a trickle, and there'll be some buffering capacity above the lip of the pipe, so that as it continues to rise in your rain garden, you don't exceed your berm before there's adequate capacity going into the pipe. You may want to consult on this if it seems to be a big enough rain garden where some problems could occur, but otherwise you can do a little trial and error, I suppose. Several inches for sure would be good. Moving along. So for ground cover in your rain garden, a lot of the times hardwood mulch is perfectly sufficient, just like any kind of landscaping you might do. It's true that the mulch in general, especially when it's fairly new mulch, will tend to float if it's in your rain garden area. But what that generally does is it forms a film, a fairly evenly distributed film of mulch, and when the water goes down, it just sets itself right back down. Actually, sometimes it makes pretty interesting shapes and patterns as all the mulch pieces align, but it'll set right back down in your rain garden, and it's really no problem. Of course, if you had a big washout from a big rain, you might have a little mulch in your yard to sweep back in, but hopefully that doesn't happen frequently, especially if you follow the design parameters and assumptions we've talked about. Rock as a substrate works. I mean, it functions. You can put it in and attempt to grow plants up through it. Sometimes it's more often put in locations where you have perhaps running water coming into the rain garden from a higher point to low point. In this drawing here, there are two downspouts that come in on the two spurs of the uphill rock. And so it's just helping to buffer the erosive capacity of that water as it makes its way down to the more circular shape there toward the bottom. So that's one option. One thing that somebody would want to be very cautious about with this, though, is if the rest of the rain garden is to be mulched, if the ponding capacity goes past the rock, gets into the mulch, then some of that mulch will float. And of course, then when it sets it back down, it'll distribute a lot of that mulch into the rock. And so, you'd have to be cautious. Typically, if you use rock, you want to take the rock all the way up to the overflow elevation. You can mulch beyond that if your rain garden extends, with more conventional landscaping around it, but just something to be aware of. Let's see here. I mentioned just landscaping fabric. I prefer not to use landscaping fabric. I like to, especially if I'm using mulch, 4 or 5 inches of mulch from the get-go right onto the bare soil. I find to be the best way to do it. As it breaks down, it turns into a little bit of compost. It facilitates air and water passage. And I think it's the better choice to use as a substrate without landscaping fabric. Though if you use rocks, like any conventional landscaping, I think it can be helpful to have a little bit of fabric under there to keep the soil particles from migrating up through your rock. Another way to avoid that, though, is to add maybe a 2-inch layer of pea gravel first and use that as your, effectively as your landscaping fabric, and then put your veneer of rock on top of that. That'd be one option. Plus that rock, if you overdug a little bit, would create a little more water holding capacity underneath the visible surface rock. And of course, plants, you could use a ground cover for plants. I have seen rain gardens where they go straight from dirt to seeding and just bring the whole rain garden up in plants. Of course, early on you'll be challenged by the weeds that try to occupy the space as the other plants mature, but it is one way to approach it. And you could argue that even a rain garden that's only occupied by almost a turf type grass still can function as a rain garden if it drains fast enough and it doesn't cause some of the, whatever the ground cover is, grass, etc., to die and be smothered out. So you do have some options there. But whatever the case is, plants should be incorporated into your rain garden somehow. And I have sort of 3 tiers of reasoning behind this. I would suspect most of you, if you're interested in this at all, already have in mind, some that you want to present plants in your gardens. That's what a garden is for. But we'll start with a more, I guess you'd say, objective benefits. Plants improve soil drainage, and they do this primarily with their root structure. So as the roots grow down through the soil, they start to loosen soil particles, and they cleave dense soils, and they create new paths for which the water can infiltrate. So there's a direct benefit from plant root mass in that. Of course, different plants put down different sizes of root mass, and they go down at different depths. And so in some way, there could be a strategy to choosing certain plants that are more beneficial to the soil. And I'll have a slide after this to illustrate this. Of course, water filtration is one of them as well. And here we're really talking about the different contaminants you might have in runoff water. In a yard, it could be pet waste in your lawn, maybe some chemicals if you've treated your lawn, but most of those are going to wash through the runoff and into your rain garden. And that's at least better than having it bypass, end up in the gutter of the road, and then end up in the storm sewers and straight out to the rivers right away. We just get an overkill of nutrients and sometimes pesticides and things that way in our river systems. So if it ends up in your rain garden, those plants will generally process those nutrients. In fact, you can have a very rapid growth of some of your plants that way if they pick up the excess fertilizers from the lawn. But in a commercial landscape, you might see these large rain gardens built around parking lots, and runoff that includes heavy metals and oils and things can end up in the rain gardens. And over time, plants, bacteria, things like that can actually break a lot of that down and sequester it into the soil. Transpiration, you hear about evaporation, water is evaporating into the air off of a pool of water, but transpiration, plants do breathe. So as plants suck up water while they're photosynthesizing, they're releasing water vapor into the air. So although all the calculations we showed earlier are simply based on water infiltrating into the soil, the transpiration from plants does contribute to absorbing some of that water and releasing it back into the atmosphere. So here's a slide. I've always liked this for various types of talks. This was developed by the Conservation Design Forum. It's an illustration of some of the, particularly the native plants, prairie plants, and comparing them to, well, in this case, lawn grass. On the far left of the image, you see this little sprig of the grass sticking up with about 2, 3, 4 inch roots. That's your standard lawn grass and the root mass they tend to produce. It's very, it's isolated to the top of your soil. Maybe a few roots go down a little further. But then we have all these different types of plants, these perennial native prairie plants, and some of them exceed, see the bottom of the image, I believe is 15 feet or so is what they're estimating. So occasionally a very mature plant can put roots way down deep into the soil. Of course, this is in part why Iowa and Illinois have had they're famous for agricultural soils, because these plants over hundreds and hundreds of years have been breaking up the soil, and root mass was living and dying, and compost was forming, and it benefited the soil greatly. So you can put this back to work in your rain garden through the plants you choose. I said, I guess 3 tiers of benefits from plants. So here's the second one. We talk about functional benefits, the habitat benefits. This part is where my hobbies, I guess, lie, as well as some of my work, with education. Pollinators are always a big thing. I mean, I think if you know about anything going on in the landscaping and plant world, you hear about pollinators, your bees and your butterflies, and even some birds, hummingbirds, etc. When you create a garden of any kind, conventional or rain garden or otherwise, if you have flowering plants produce pollen, this can be greatly beneficial to the pollinators. One reason we use native plants more frequently, in rain gardens is also because of the cognizance of this pollinator issue, in addition to the root mass benefits we just showed. And so many native plants, have their host plants. So some pollinators are exclusive to certain native plants, and then other plants are more generalist. So many different kinds of insects and pollinators can feed upon those plants, and incorporating them into your rain garden is one way you can help that out, as well as have something you can observe in your own yard. Of course, birds and other wildlife. Let's see here. Finally, a slide that isn't just text and otherwise. Just a few illustrations here then. Monarchs, we talked about pollinators. Everybody loves monarchs, I think. And if you incorporate milkweed plants into your rain gardens, you'll end up with monarchs. This is actually one that was found on one of my milkweeds, and my kids and I brought it in, and we just waited until it came out of its chrysalis. It was still green when we found it, and then just as it approaches emergence, it clears up just like this. You can see right inside. So those are really cool. I love being able to go out in the garden, if only just to look for creatures like that. Some birds do prefer certain plants. If you're into birds, this goldfinch here on the echinacea, the purple coneflower, they love purple coneflowers. So you could certainly go to the internet and do some research if you're trying to attract birds and plant a garden that attracts particular birds you're interested in. I'm a big fan of reptiles and amphibians. We have some toads that are residents of our rain garden, so we put out some rocks and create some cavities, and they live in there year round. We have a lot of fun with that. And I guess who doesn't like a praying mantis? This is also one I found in my garden. So you can have quite a few things show up. And in part, I do attribute this to the native plants in particular. Again, it's not that you can't use the non-native plants, but there's some other perks that come with the native. All right, our final section here. I would say that the beauty of a rain garden, or the flowering plants we put into it, is probably the universal thing. I mean, everybody appreciates beauty, from the youngest of us to the oldest. And if for any other reason, if you go through all that process to create a rain garden, that functions as a canvas, you might as well fill your canvas as best you can. And so again, another primary reason to use plants. Let's see here. So maybe what I'd highlight is, just to stay on the native plant theme, there are hundreds of different plants that are now readily available. And in general, the textures and the way they look, whether they're water loving, shade or sun, whatever the case may be, the options really are endless. And so once you find some vendors and start to browse them, peruse them, I think it can inspire you to create a garden, to whatever aesthetic you're going for. Just across here, even here, just a variety of indigo plant here to the left versus ferns versus pale purple coneflower. These are some of my favorites to include when I can in a rain garden. Here are more varieties. I give credit in the bottom of this slide for prairie-moon.com. This is one of these nurseries I speak about. I have no affiliation with them, but they're one I've used in the past. So just as an example, there are vendors out there. I think they're from Wisconsin. But sedges in the top left corner, they have their own look. Bottom left, a little blue stem. Cardinal flowers, they love, kind of that rain garden, maybe a wetter rain garden. They do great. Attract hummingbirds. I've sat near a rain garden and just sat there, just feet away from these plants, and the hummingbirds come in, and kind of an exciting way to enjoy your garden. Just other varieties here. The aster at the bottom. Let's see, columbine, the pink flowers third over to the right. They work great in a shady garden. Of course, there's irises. And then finally on the bottom right, these are wild ginger, which I've seen some people use effectively as a replacement for hostas and things. They will create a ground cover and spread. They're certainly not as big as hostas, but they're kind of a neat plant. And I've experimented with those for a little bit.
Are they pretty aggressive though?
I don't find them to be. And sometimes actually I'm waiting on them to spread. So if you have a number of that you can spread out and get them to try to grow together, it does take some time. So
They're not aggressive.
yeah, there you go. Thank you, sir. So I highlighted a few of these when I went through those photos. So just things to consider. Again, I kind of consider this the fun part of the process once you've gotten through the math and the planning. Thinking about the different heights and colors and textures is important. How you present something, perhaps taller plants towards the back, shorter stature plants to the front. Think about seasonality. A lot of these plants have very small flowering windows, others are longer. But staggering different plant blooms and things, maybe what you're after. I've seen gardens that remain rather just green all year long till that particular blooming window, and the whole thing explodes at the same time. that can be an interesting effect. And then thinking about perhaps even the fall foliage. Some of those plants look quite nice just standing through the fall. And then presentation, intentional versus wild. I couldn't think of a better term in this case. I suppose to illustrate this, this was my first prototype garden for myself before I even thought about doing this professionally years ago. But my objective was just to have something that was kind of organic, had some composition and balance, but wasn't really designed around any other motif. So the larger bushy type plants in this, for my indigo, and then I have several irises, and there's some coneflower that come up, and spiderwort. But again, I think most people think of gardening, they want something that just, it looks like somebody intended to put the plant there. That's the intention of this slide. Now, conversely, though, you can go for emulating a small prairie or wetland type area, and just create it to that effect. In this case, we have a sand prairie with different species growing. But if you start from seed, this can be really easy to accomplish, because you just be putting out the seed that you'd like in your rain garden, whatever mix that may be, and letting it come up over time. That being said, I don't think you have to be one or the other extreme, this so-called intentional versus wild. You can take something like this and reduce the palette of seeds you put into it, say. So you're not necessarily planting individual plants, but you're planting textures and colors of plants. I've heard it said that sticking to a sort of a lower diversity mix, 2 to 3 species even, it creates a sense of intentionality, even if it's a sort of a haphazard placement. And of course, you can just imagine maybe a garden that's just one particular monoculture of flowers. No one will question whether or not you intended to put them there, but you're not wrestling with individual placement and planting that way. So what is another option? Let's see, we're almost done here. Plan for mature growth and think ahead about maintenance. So there is maintenance involved, certainly for the first few years. And although a lot of people try to suggest it becomes low maintenance later, I would say that's, sometimes I just say if you're lucky. It just depends on what kind of garden you have and your particular situation. So I just bring this up as an example. On the left there is this garden planted early, but you can imagine several years later, those plants are going to expand and fill space and grow. And so you see this sort of a big collection of plants on the far right there. Now, this picture does this garden an injustice just because it's a lot of sedges, cool season type of things that through the first half of the year that this garden looks very nice. And then as it gets later in the year, the plants get a little bit lazy and hot in the days of summer, and they flop down. But depending on how you trim it or weed it, etc., just think ahead of how it will look down the road as opposed to how it looks necessarily at the beginning. Thinking ahead is good. This is my last slide. I'll just say I'm kind of just trying to preemptively answer maybe a couple questions here, or a few questions, as well as just the last few pointers. So after all is said and done, if we end up having a rain garden, a canvas that fits some of the criteria I've discussed earlier, then I think at this point, when you're finally making your choices to choose your plants and get them installed, your primary thing to consider is sunlight. So if you're imagining, you've got a well-drained garden like we've created, this is where you just want to make sure you pair your plants with the available sunlight. And again, endless resources online and plant vendors that will allow you to consider these things. Native versus non-native. I prefer native. You can get away with non-native plants. Many do well. I mean, even hostas and things, any run-of-the-mill type of plant generally will survive in a fairly well-drained rain garden. And they may have their purpose. I will admit that my favorite iris is the Siberian iris, and versus the native flag irises, I tend to opt for the Siberian iris just because it behaves the way I want it to in some of the work I do. But it's just one example where maybe you use a little bit of both. Perennials versus annuals. Perennial plants being ones that come up from the same root mass year after year. I would definitely recommend perennials. To be honest, I've never experimented with annuals, but I'm sure there's somebody out there that's tried. So, no harm in seeing how they behave in a rain garden. I would guess that some annuals, being fairly delicate, may not withstand flooding, or certainly prolonged flooding from heavy rains as well. So, be cognizant of that. Seed plugs, potted plants. I just call this, it's about time. You can effectively end up with the same rain garden, however you approach it. But of course, seed, you're starting from scratch. Plugs, basically you get a 1 year head start, then potted plants. It depends on the size of the plant. I would say potted plants, 3-inch plants is a nice compromise, and that's what this picture is here. These are basically 2-year-old plants. And even if, if you do mail order versus direct purchase, even if they come in a little beat up, a lot of these I found will still come back from the root stock. So you get a little bit of insurance policy on the plants you install, being able to count on them to grow. Just last point, bulbs and bare roots. I've seen gardens effectively made that use, your standard spring bulbs, and they work all right. I think the biggest caution there is a garden that stays wet too long and you get some root or bulb rot, so to speak. Again, just experiment, I suppose. I'm sure there's somebody out there that has a go-to manual on how to approach that as well. And I've also had success with bare root plants. And I just throw that out there, the tidbit. As long as you know how to plant a bare root plant well, you can, again, these can be ordered fairly inexpensively, but it takes some care to make sure they get started well. So that was a lot of information. And we'll end here on this. One thing I'll point out, and I forgot to at the beginning, so it was on the first slide, but this particular document, Our Rain Garden Design and Installation Guide, you could almost argue that I've structured this talk a bit on this guide. I'm not affiliated with them, but I found this to be really helpful. And in a way, everything I've said today, I think you could find how it fits into this. The link, or rather the address I have here at the bottom is where you can go to, I believe, download a PDF copy, but they also have an ebook, maybe through Amazon, and some other ways to access that guide. Perhaps if you reach out to them, you could get a hard copy. I always like holding something in my hand. But I do think this is very helpful. It can simultaneously be a fairly overwhelming guide because it is fairly comprehensive in the way it presents things. But it would lead you to some of the steps I've given you today. And so I guess that'd be my final point. And no, I appreciate it. I'd be happy to answer any questions. And no, thanks for your patience today and attention.
Any questions from the crowd, in person or online? I have a question.
Yes.
So you recommend keeping it at least 10 feet away from the foundation of your house.
Mhm.
The area I have in mind in our yard, it's like a low-lying part of our yard that water just kind of sits, but it's close to the garage,
Mhm.
which is not attached to our house. Should it also be at least 10 feet away from the garage?
I think the conventional wisdom would be yes.
Okay,
I don't think it has to be a hard and fast rule, but if I was to advise on it, I think that would probably be something to do if you could.
okay.
That being said, I have in my own personal work around my own house had some rain gardens where part of it was a little bit closer, and I knew that the drain around our foundation was good. We weren't having issues, certainly around our basement. You get a little more careful, but around just a freestanding foundation or slab, I think you can get away with it. But conventional wisdom would say move it a little bit further away.
Did you say about 10 feet away from your foundation?
I think that's a good rule of thumb, yes.
Anyone else?
Yes, sir.
The only comment there's always seems to be a dearth of suggestions for decent plants.
Mhm.
And I don't necessarily agree with a lot of the typical selections.
Mhm.
I think they're, efficient in a lot of ways. And I don't know, where I'm coming from, I've got 3 different rain gardens in my yards I've had over 20 years.
Sure.
So I've been doing it a while. I made a lot of mistakes. But I won't put blue baptisia in my yard, especially when I think that white baptisia, which is actually native to this area,
Mhm.
I think is a far superior plant.
Sure.
It's just what I call a wow plant. It looks like a giant white candelabra. And otherwise, the sedges, I noticed that you complained about the sedges, and that's a valid complaint. The reason being because you use fox sedge, and that's the one they always recommend. And it's Carrots bull benoides,
Mhm.
fox sedge. But it always looks raggy. I mean, you get a little bit past, stuff to maturity and it's flops
Sure.
and opens up and it just looks like crap. If you use another one, it's a local sedge. It's called palm sedge often.
Yep. That rain garden actually was half palm sedge and half.
And the palm sedge is always erect, isn't it? And also palm sedge is virtually evergreen. So it's a far superior sedge. Some other ones I've used are wine cups that kind of weave their way through it, and they're gorgeous and nobody grows them.
Sure.
But they're what I call a bioplant. But they're,
Yeah, in some ways, I deliberately avoided trying to make too many recommendations,
I know,
other
where
than
you
things
find
I've either used or seen, just because really what you're suggesting is part of it's kind of the eye of the beholder, but on the other hand, there are some plants that are just easier to use. And frankly, everybody has an opinion on a lot of those. But I would suggest, I love the native, the white indigo, the baptisia as well. I happen to use those at the time because that's what I found, and they work really well for me. But nonetheless, when choosing plants, yeah, I mean, there's probably no limit to the research you could do. And but finding somebody like yourself who actually has local experience with it, I mean, I would definitely recommend that. And that being said, I don't have a lot of it other than what I've grown that has succeeded, and I tend to forget the things that have failed. But yeah, that's a very good point.
So I don't see.
So is your company a landscape company?
This is the hardest answer or question for me to answer. I do many things. I call myself an ecological consulting company. And like I said, I kind of have put together my many years working in earth moving growing up, family business, and then my background in conservation biology. So I've done a range of projects. I do some more conventional or native landscaping, rain gardens. I've built designed and built multi-acre farm ponds, recreational ponds. I'll work on prairie restorations and invasive control. I'm kind of all over the place. I do graphic design sometimes, interpretive science. But I'm a one-man band at this point. My wife and I own the business, but I've been at this for about 12 years now. And I say I managed to keep the bills, so at least, or keep paying the bills, and that's the most important part for us. And we have 3 children and such. But I generally say if it has anything to do with sort of an outdoors ecological bent, certainly plants, ask me about it, and I'll let you know if I'm, can't say much on it or not. I'll be honest with you on that. But I do a number of various things that all kind of hover around.
And he does them well, speaking from our
Thanks.
experience.
Looks like somebody else kind of alluded to a similar question about seeing if you could come check out their place.
Yeah, no,
I think now you just have to go to each one of our homes, give us your feedback, and then we'll
Sure.
be good to go.
no, and that's actually a good point. I have worked on projects in any capacity, whether it's simply just show up and take a quick look. I generally don't charge for that. If you're asking for a little more detail, I'm happy just to consult, provide, and do the calculations for you and provide some information that way, and then design and installation. So I guess that's the luxury of being a one-man band. Is it my own boss? I'll step in where it seems most beneficial, and again all the way to the end where I'm the guy, either with a machine or a shovel. It doesn't bother me to sweat. But yeah, if you'd like me to come, contact me, please do. I'd love to meet with you and see what you have.
Awesome. Well, again, this has all been recorded, and your contact information is on the website. If not, I can add it there, or you can reach out to myself or take a picture, however you want to get in touch. I can help get you there as well. But appreciate your expertise and your time and your fountain of knowledge. Thanks again, Mick.
Sure, appreciate it.
Kelsey, where is the water testing? Where do we go to?
The upcoming snapshot will be at Davenport Public Works.
Okay, that's good. Thank you.
Yep.
I'll sign up later this week,
Excellent.
but I need somebody to do iPad type thing.
Got you covered, Gary.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Awesome. Thank you all for coming, both on Zoom and again in person. If you're here in person, please take a extra sandwich or bag of chips or what have you with you. And yeah, we'll see you at the next Conservation Quarterly in May. Thanks, everyone.